Welcome to our presentation on L2 learning experiences, emotions, and their integration into a learner's English life narrative. My name is Amelia Yarwood, and my supervisor for this project is Osamu Takuichi. It is one part of a much larger dissertation project. So before we begin, I would like to inform you that due to the time limits, the methodology section will be greatly condensed. However, for those of you who are interested in learning more, I invite you to please email after the presentation. And so without further ado, let us begin. I'd like to begin with a quote from two leading theorists in narrative inquiry. What this quote shows is that life is often made sense of through narratives. What we tend to do is piece together stories. Some of that are whole, some are in fragments, some are from our past, our present, or even our imagined futures. And we do this to form our own version of our lives, an effective reality, or perhaps an example of a lived experience, if you will. And so this view of life and narrative and ways of understanding who we are was really helpful for me as a learning advisor when I was working at a Japanese university that specialized in foreign language education. And this was largely because a big part of my job was eliciting stories from my students about their language learning experiences. And after listening to story after story after story, I started to really see how these stories that they were telling about who they were as language learners and about their experiences were actually influencing the behaviors and actions that they took, their beliefs, as well as how they perceived themselves. Some were positive stories and some were unfortunately very negative stories. And so this raised several questions, but the one that we're going to focus on today is how do autobiographical narratives of L2 learning influence, inform, and are integrated into the life narrative of a Japanese learner of English? To break this down a little bit more, what we need to do is first identify what a life narrative is. So a life narrative is a cohesive and coherent story that brings together notions of self that exist at different points in the past, present, and future, in different locations and across different social contexts. Autobiographical narratives, or narratives about our own experiences, are often smaller snippets of this much larger life narrative, but they definitely give us a lot of information on how a life narrative is informed. And so, as I may have already implied, as humans, we love a good story, and our own stories are the most important. So for language learners, the stories that they share about their language learning has really been shown to exert an influence on their sense of self, but also their future actions. And this is something that I definitely saw as a language learning advisor. So as an advisor, but also as an educator, it's really important for me to know more about how my learners understand their lives as English learners. And so that inspired this particular study. What I did is I decided to use a longitudinal case study approach, and that allowed me to cover my students' far and recent past experiences, as well as their current experiences during their first year of university. Since I was interested in narrative, the interpretivist, constructivist lens of narrative inquiry was most assuredly the most appropriate one to use. Now, just briefly, there are a few things I need to clarify in terms of narrative inquiry, because they are a little bit different from other forms of qualitative research. The first thing you need to know is that narrative inquiry acknowledges the subjectivity of human experience. Secondly, it frames narratives as experiences that are told to an audience, and that audience could be me as the researcher, it could be a friend, or it could even be the learner themselves, for example, during a diary entry. Finally, narrative inquiry highlights the agentative and co-constructed nature of narratives. Who the narrator is sharing their story with will change how the story is told, and for that reason, we do need to take into account the relationship between the narrator and the audience. For this presentation, however, we don't have the time to go into it, but please seek out later publications for a much fuller discussion of this particular issue. As I mentioned just before, subjectivity is key in narrative inquiry, and it's also key in understanding who we are as individuals. Each of our experiences and how we express our emotions are unique to us, and they are shaped by the experiences that we do have, the situation as it presents itself, and any cultural norms that we tend to enact. All emotional experiences, however, are not necessarily considered to be equal in terms of being integrated into a life narrative. Rather, it's the more emotionally intense experiences that tend to be integrated or form the emotional core of a life narrative. In other words, we tend to tell stories that have a much more intense impact on us, but perhaps also on the audience as well. So moving on to the study itself, my participant was Kana. To give you a little information about Kana, she is a first-year English major at the university where I worked. She didn't have any study abroad experience, and she was born and raised in Japan. In terms of the CEFR framework, she is at an A2 level. In terms of TOEIC scores, that's between 440 and 540. And this was at the time of the interview. She did mention that she struggled with speaking and listening tasks, but despite these struggles, she absolutely loves English. And one day she would like to have a job in which she uses English, although she's not entirely sure what kind of job that is just yet. Prior to this study, though, I had never met Kana, and she was actually one of the first volunteers after she received the notification of this study through a plain language statement. And that plain language statement was distributed to all of the students who were enrolled in a self-directed language learning module. And so to elicit narratives from Kana, I first asked her to email me her language learning history. And this was actually a part of the self-directed language learning module that she was enrolled in. And so it didn't take any extra time for her to complete. One of the benefits of using this particular activity is that it is multimodal. It uses images as well as writing. And the use of those emojis at the end there was incredibly helpful for me because it allowed me to clarify the emotions that she was experiencing during these events. But when we actually interviewed or had an interview, it also allowed me to ask her to elaborate more on what specifically these emojis meant to her in terms of her emotions. So to get more in-depth information about these events and how she experienced them, we did an interview. This interview was conducted in both English and Japanese at the request of Kana, and it was conducted on Zoom very soon after she submitted her language learning history. As I mentioned, it was during this interview that she elaborated more on the stories that she describes here. At the end of the interview, I asked Kana to describe her English identity, to which she responded in Japanese. なんかそう、ちっちゃい頃からやったのもあってそこがスタートだけど、もっと上手くなって、なんかかっこよく喋りたい. Now, I apologize for my pronunciation there. In English, though, that is translated to, I've been doing this English since I was little, but I want to become more skilled and sound cooler when I speak. And so as you can see, a lot of the experiences that she spoke about started at the age of 6 and went all the way through to her first semester or first month at university. In terms of analysis, the interview was transcribed and broken into separate self-contained stories known as short stories. These were analyzed for content, so who, where, and when, but they were also analyzed for context. So context here is micro, meso, and macro. The micro level considers Kana's emotions, thoughts, and beliefs. The meso level considers the interactions she had with others and institutions, and the macro considers the wider socio-political and cultural discourses of societies. So this analysis was used to holistically understand the characters, situations, and influences in Kana's emotional experiences, and the references you can see are right here. In addition to that, I also use an emotional qualities analysis, and this was used to examine her emotional world in more detail. And so we looked at the emotions that she experienced, the positive or negative tones she assigned to them, and any changes in that emotional tonality. And so these two forms of analysis were then used as a foundational basis for the narrative writing approach. And it was during this approach or process that several of the short stories were examined, and those with common themes were combined. And this was done to better understand elements of Kana's English learning narrative as a whole. And so although I haven't arrived at a single narrative just yet, Kana's life narrative could be considered to be broken into three larger narratives or holistic narratives, cohesive narratives, there we go. And so in today's presentation, we're going to introduce one of the life narratives that Kana selected as being most representative of her relationship with English. For those of you who are interested, here's an example of my analysis. And please keep in mind, it was a very reiterative and collaborative process in which I did invite feedback from Kana. The process also took about a month and a half. And here's an example of the timeline. So moving into the life narratives that Kana felt were most representative of her relationship with English, I present to you the competitor. We decided to give this life narrative a name of its own, so it could have its own identity, and we chose the competitor. And so this became what we started calling an identity statement. Now, the emotions that were integrated into this narrative are primarily pride, determination, and yearning, each of which I will explore in more detail. In the next few slides, though, I'm going to present you with a segment of the identity statement in the corner and a short extract from the short story that contributed to its formation. And we will look at each of these to illustrate some of the contextual factors, some of the emotions and the core identity concerns that are all bound up in these identity statement, or this identity statement. So pride is the first one we'll look at, and it was important to Kana as it relates back to a core emotional concern, specifically being as good as the people around her. Although, side note, she did tell me that first of all, she wants to be as good, and then later she wants to be better than others. Either way, she was a successful learner from elementary all the way through to high school, and her success gave her confidence as well as the space to distinguish herself from her less proficient peers. And the students that she's talking about in this extract specifically are those in her immediate class. And she will talk about her classmates who are in the same year, in the same cohort, but in different classes later on. And that's going to be quite important for her English learner narrative. But what did all of that suggest? Well, in terms of emotions at the micro level, it shows that Kana's pride depends on how she evaluates herself in relation to those in her immediate environment. It lends itself to an increase in confidence. And when that confidence is sustained, it appears that it is integrated into her narrative as an English learner. At the meso level, we see that the Japanese high school classroom, with its really strong test focus, as well as its use of paired speaking activities, created a space for comparison and self-evaluation. And although it wasn't specifically identified in that extract, Kana did tell me that she often did a lot of paired speaking activities. Now, in this exchange, Kana was telling me about the students who were in the same year or cohort as her, but in different classes. She really appears to value their English abilities, and this is evidenced by the high scores that they received on standardized English proficiency exams. This one in particular is called the ACEN. And it seems that Kana seeks to develop her own abilities to match theirs. And we see this most clearly when she states, "So I have to study hard," in this line here. Yearning transforms into determination, but I think the foundation of this transformation really lies in the narrative that has existed for a long time for Kana. And that's as someone who identifies themselves as competitive. And you can see that here when Kana says, "I hate to lose, you know. I hate to lose. It's my personality. It's who I am." And so this segment of Kana's story reveals to us that she acknowledges her competitive traits as something that is lasting. It's integral to her life narrative in general, and it's not just for English. So for her, this is a very significant emotional concern. At the meso to the macro level, we can also see that high school continues to function as a space for comparison and self-evaluation, but it's also normalizing competition, especially in terms of language proficiency. And we get the sense that there's a lot of discussion and perhaps even celebration of those who obtain high scores. You only have to think to your own experience in high school to get that sense as well. So this act of discussing and celebrating high scores, it really reinforces the value and the social capital that standardized testing can offer. And in the context of Japan, standardized testing can be seen as a socially acceptable form of competition. For Kana, whose competitive traits are already in existence, this environment might really intensify the emotions that she's experiencing. And so this environment is providing her with plenty of opportunities to develop an even stronger identity as someone who's driven by determination and yearning, who wants to be as good or even better than others. So continuing on with the theme of determination, in this section, we've got Kana's story, which highlights her willingness to seek support in order to meet her goals. And those goals are ones that are aligned with her focus on socially acceptable forms of competition, comparison, and self-evaluation. And so here what we see is that Kana is seeking out the support of her English teacher. And she demonstrates her willingness to practice 2 or 3 times a week at lunch in order to pass the speaking component of the ACEN second grade exam, something that she actually failed earlier in the year. Thankfully, her teacher was also willing to give up their lunchtimes 2 or 3 times a week. So I'm not going to go into the great detail here, but hopefully you're starting to see some of those overlapping themes and how Kana's learning environment is really helping to facilitate a particular narrative when it comes to Kana's English learning identity. And so although the stories we have shared with you today are predominantly set in the high school context, the pride Kana felt began much, much earlier, and it pervades her experience of English learning through elementary, junior high school, and her high school classes. Likewise, so did her competitive traits. The environment, however, really appears to allow for repeated experiences and repeat narrative retellings of Kana as someone who is competitive, someone who learns English in a manner that is driven by pride, determination, and yearning. So to conclude, we have summarized some of the key components of Kana's learning environment and how her emotions, personality, and thoughts have interacted with the surrounding environment. Although at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that intense emotional experiences are more likely to be integrated and form the emotional core of a life narrative, in Kana's case, it almost seems like some of those smaller experiences that are being reinforced over and over and over again are also being integrated into her emotional core or into her life narrative. Because it certainly seems that she's not going through any intense experiences, with the exception of failing the ACAN pre-2 grade and going through that intense period of study. Other than that, she didn't really tell me about any life-changing or major turning points in her language learning. It's just that accumulation of smaller experiences, but smaller experiences that have the same emotions. And so finally, this is for the teachers. I really just want to highlight the importance of learner narratives. Everybody has a story to tell, and it is through the stories that we are able to make sense of who we are. So please seek to learn more about the stories your learners have to share. And by looking at those stories, we can start to piece together how we perceive who we are as language learners. And for some of your students whose stories might be largely characterized by negative emotions, it also provides you with an opportunity to help them to rewrite or retell their narrative so that it is in a more growth-orientated light. Thank you very much for listening. As the main researcher on this project, if you do have any questions, please contact me at this address. And finally, thank you very much to Career TESOL for this opportunity to present. Thank you very much and have a wonderful conference.